Welcome to Progenesis Academy webinar. I am very excited to restart the webinar along with my team here at Progenesis Academy. We have been out for a few months and we were trying to recap and then rethink how the webinar should be, because we have covered so many webinars in the past and we were running out of topics. But now we are taking a new turn, a new spin to the webinars, and it's going to be very exciting. We have Dr. Sheila Ali, our VP of Science and Innovation, that is going to be driving this project of webinars, and I'm very excited to see how it's going to play out. Today, we have a very important topic. It's about KPI and AI. It's an interesting combination of two very interesting tools that are used to maximize the output of a clinical lab. We have three wonderful speakers. I'm going to be presenting them one at a time. Each one will have about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes presentation. Starting the first presentation for Dr. Sung-T Kim. He has 25 years of experience as in reproductive biologist, currently working as a lab director at the University Hospital Fertility Center and faculty member at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. Kim, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for your generous introduction. Hi, everyone. It is a great honor to present here the Progenesis Academy. Today, I'm going to present how are we improving our quality and outcomes. And I will specifically share my experience over the last 3 years since taking the lab director role at University Hospitals in Cleveland. As you know, the IVF, looks like the old IVF and looks very simple. After stimulation of the eggs, and egg and sperm are retrieved and fertilized, and the resulting embryos are cultured for up to 7 days in the lab to produce blastocysts. 1 or 2 embryos will be selected for transfer by either morphologic assessment or genetic method. The remaining usable embryo can be frozen for further use. The patient then undergoes the pregnancy test at 9 to 10 days post-transfer. But this is not all, as you know. Okay. Can we move the next slide? Yeah. The IVF journey is the best approached as a team and require cross cooperation between the providers, nurses, and admin area, and of course, the lab. Each of these areas have different responsibilities. Even though the team is responsible for performing their own tasks, the many tasks are shared or collaborative, and communication between groups is essential to have the best possible outcomes for the patient for each cycle. Okay. Next slide. This is the paper that I wrote with my IVF medical director, Dr. Fricks, and others on teaming. In the paper, we showed that in teaming, interchangeable elements that function together to allow a group to excel as a high-functioning unit, regardless of who is on the team. Unlike a traditional team, which is really a group of people who collaborate regularly, the teaming involves the collaboration of rotating and often unfamiliar components toward a goal of excellence. So teaming happens very frequently in the lab and the clinics. Okay. Also, it is important to understand what factor can impact the KPIs. Not only human factors, including technical competencies, but functional equipment, protocol, and policy and cycle management can also affect the outcomes. So I would like to share my 3-year experience in university hospital. Next slide. So what was my strategy? Initially, I focused on the quality control, assurance, and then improvement by observation, analysis, and planning in different areas: lab, department policy, workflow, and cycle management, and safety and security. These are very important concepts in running an IVF unit, and any unit can use these concepts. Right? The next slide. The first, the lab. The lab has a few components: the equipment, staffing, competency, training, and protocol. Okay, let's move. Every lab does this routinely, but easily lose how important step it is. This is the first step to catch whether lab is functioning properly or not. For daily QC, we ask 2 questions. Is it okay? And how are you sure? With weekly or monthly QC, the catching function fluctuation will be a great opportunity before equipment failure. So proper corrective action and follow-up should be done with the proper communication. Also, reliable verification method should be used. One of important thing for QC is whether the measurement is the same condition with your procedure or not. This is the one example of finding a better method for QC. The incubator is one of the key equipment for embryo culture by supporting CO2 and oxygen with the temperature. So optimal CO2 concentration allows optimal pH of culture media. So we culture embryos in 50 microliter of media drop overlaid by oil. The measuring gas is the indirect method for the culture condition, and pH measurement is a direct method. The many IVF labs use both methods using different method or equipment. The most popular method is using this conventional pH meter. But the limitation is that we have to use the large volume of media, about 1 to 1.5 ml, without oil overlay, which is the different condition to culture dish. The pH sensitivity of 50 microliter versus 1.5 ml will be different. So I asked to vendor to bring gas analyzer to check the pH from the micro drop, and we compared with our pH meter to check the pH difference between gas analyzer and conventional pH meter. Then we have data that our pH meter measurement is usually 0.3 lower than the gas analyzer. So now we have very narrow range of optimal pH. We can skip this one. So second thing is that most of the procedure is done by person. So understanding lab person and work environment is important. The society's comprehensive guideline is very helpful for all aspects of the lab management, especially the IVF lab work environment is very stressful. So all procedure is time sensitive, specimen and patient ID, workload, and the pressure of outcomes. So in embryologists, the mental health is generally very poor. So we need to carefully watch this, whether any lab staff burned out or not. So according to the 2018 SRBT survey, the embryologist who is at least 5-year experience feels very frequently the burnout and high stress level. I'm sure you agree that the competency evaluation is one of the important factors for keeping high quality of service and proper rotation in the lab. It is important to check whether each step does work equally in all aspects of performance and admin duties. Then you can decide whether case assignment need to be rearranged or changing rotation or schedule or re-education or need to add a step or not. As you see on my the case assignment evaluation showed the one the senior embryologist do work less than all other three. So I rearranged all the assignment. 3 to 4 months after I joined the team, then I added some protocol to increase efficiency and have better outcome. So the purpose of the competency evaluation is not to point out a step, but to minimize technical gap and to increase the high standard. So this is the example of our competency evaluation. So by the observation and analyzed the previous year's data, and I analyzed each lab steps the evaluation. Then I watch their performance, whether they have any technical difference or whether they need a technical advice. So then I give them to each the goal and benchmark value to each individual lab steps. And then 3 months later, I initially reevaluate how they improve their competency and how comfortable with the new techniques. And then next year, I review same manner and whether they reached out their own goals and reduced any the degeneration or local rate from the biopsy result. So the communication between lab director and the lab staff is also very important, and how much they also it is important to show to the lab staff how lab directors are supportable to each lab staff. So that is also the show how important the relationship between lab director and lab staff. And I try to help for the lab staff to have balance between technique and experience and education. And the lab staff easily access to me to have open discussion regarding their need or goal. Also encourage the participating professional meeting or webinar. Especially the recognition by coworkers, leaders, and also the compensation readjustment based on the market value. Those are also the important elements. When you have the failed cycle or failed case, and it is very easy to blame the laboratory, but the lab director should review each cases to find the reason, whether that's from the poor prognosis patient issues or technical issues or equipment or environmental issues. Yeah, next slide. When you discuss with the clinical team and try to bring the data, your own data, we can still have the clinical flexibility under the policy. So when everyone trusts the lab, this will be very easy. I want to share the one example, whether or not the fresh embryo transfer versus the freeze, or that is the progesterone cutoff value was 1.5, and we are using the hospital laboratory for hormone assay. But some point, we had increased the biochemical pregnancies. So after some research, we found the lab changed their blood analyzer. So we requested a blind test using same sample and found some fluctuation of progesterone around the cutoff level. So all biochemical and no pregnancy happened between 1.1 and 1.5 of progesterone. So we reset our cutoff value to 1.0 for having fresh embryo transfer. The second thing is using SALT is very good resource to audit your own clinic and laboratory. This is the one another example of the discussion with the regarding the department policy. So I found our cycle cancellation is very higher than the national average, and no one knew this how we did this one. Since we trust the lab culture environment, we were very comfortable to proceed with poor responder who have only 2 mature follicles. So as we can see, our cancellation has been significantly reduced in 2020 and 2021 without impacting our outcomes. The last thing, the cycle management also can affect workload and efficiency, eventually the outcome. Once you start IVF cycle, it is very limited to manage a cycle. So when I look at the previous cycle volume per week before 2019, it was very irregular. Sometimes 3 egg retriever per week, but some week we have 12 and 18 per week. So each team had very different capacity according to the number of steps and available equipment or space. So it is important to understanding team's capacity to keep the same quality of service and making plan for the future growth and development. Next slide. Everyone was so excited with our the improvement of pregnancy outcome in 2020. As you can see, the big jump of our improvement. So we had so many patients coming, and so historically we did not manage the cycle volume. Whenever patient want to start, they start at any time. This can impact the steps, workload, stress, mistakes, and eventually the outcome. So in 2021, our cycle volume was dramatically increased and very every steps overwhelmed with weekly volume. So our average weekly volume was 10 egg retriever per week, but after July 2021, it was increased up to 18 to 20 retrievers per week. So the recovery room after retrieval was over full. So this was related to the delaying procedure. This also occurred the staffing rotation issue and increased the work hour in the clinical area and the laboratory. Especially the number of culture dish per big box incubator was increased from 2 to 4 patients. This did not impact to the pregnancy rate, however, reduced the blastocyst rate by 5%. So hospital leadership supported to buy 2 benchtop incubators to resolve these issues. And also we hired more nurses and admin staff as well as the lab staff, but space issue was not really clear. So we
Dr. Kim?
we decide to limit our cycle volume up to 5 to 16, 15 to 16 egg retrieval per week. So our the 2020 livers has been published to the public through the SART, and we saw that this improved outcomes, and we are keep looking watching this improvement. Right. In addition to the educational purpose, the retrospective study can be used for making or updating your own standard or guideline. So this is the very important, and so you should have your own criteria, because of most of the we will discuss about the automation or AI, but the most of the conventional the embryo assessment or selecting the embryo by morphology is very subjective. So you should have your own criteria, and everyone follows the same standard. This is the lab activity for the study. So with all together, so I believe the clinical team works as a functional ovary to provide a good quality of oocyte. The IVF lab works as a functional tube to support the embryo development. Then altogether, the successful outcome will be resulted from the great teamwork and teaming. Thank you for your attention, and I'd like to have the question and.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dr. Kim. Thank you so much. We are a little behind the clock right now, behind time. It's 3:26, so maybe hopefully we can wrap up the two other presentation in below 20 minutes, so we can have a little bit of time for questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Caroline Couture. She is a Director of Medical Affairs at AIVF, also founder at Arts Compass. Her current research interest is artificial intelligence, big data science, digitization of IVF lab, and automation. Carol, thank you so much for joining in.
Thank you so much for having me back. The last time that I spoke at a Progenesis webinar, it was something very unusual in all of science and medicine. It was an all-female panel. So it's such a pleasure to be back here. Today, I'm going to talk about laboratory automation. And I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of developing a tool to digitize IVF labs and then having that acquired by AIVF. So AIVF acquired ART Compass, and now we are joining forces and joining the two products together to bring AI into the IVF lab. So those are my disclosures as well. I was the founder of Art Compass, and it has now been acquired by AIVF. So what I built, Art Compass, is the first step in the line of automation. It is a platform to digitize IVF lab data. And what we're looking to in the future is a more interconnected future. So we have a lot of point solutions right now. A point solution is kind of a software that takes care of one specific problem, but it's not all connected. And we're playing in the area of the lower right-hand corner, but there's so much to the whole IVF ecosystem that interacts with our lab and our patients and our embryos. And so there's so much more in terms of prevention, diagnosis, interaction with the physicians and the physician's assistants, and telehealth and telemedicine. So when I think about automation, I think about taking our digitization to the next level. Okay, so what we want to do is not just save a PDF document into our EMR, but we want to extend our reach, improve our outcomes, engage our patients, provide enterprise level support, and also provide ourselves with research opportunities. Okay, so when I'm thinking about extending our reach, I'm thinking about extending it from the IVF lab and into the realm of regulatory and security. So that's going to be our HIPAA compliance, our institutional review boards, and also our risk assessments for the whole practice, for our IVF lab particularly, but for the whole practice. I'm also thinking about the costs. So there are a lot of different licensing costs when you have a lot of different point solutions. And there's also issues with content integration and integration of third-party hardware. So data integration and hardware integration. There are numerous long-term costs. Those can come in the form of expertise, clinical trials, which are very expensive to run, or bioinformatics. So having, servers and the expertise to crunch all that data and store all that data long-term can have a very high cost. So when you're thinking especially about a time-lapse incubator, for example, it's going to take millions of images. And all of those need to be stored somewhere and then accessible. So all of that has a long-term cost. And that's just one piece of instrumentation in our lab we can think of. I can think of dozens of others. And I also think about extending our reach through care escalation. So we're talking here about managing our patient expectations, increasing our touch points with patients to increase this sort of what we call high touch healthcare. So we all know that there's a huge emotional and psychological component to IVF, and digital technology can help us to manage that and extend our reach into our patients' lives. So what I've learned is that launching a product is really just the beginning. So there's maintenance, there's safety, there's creating population impact, and there can also be a focus on what I call the wrong priorities. So as far as maintenance goes, on a routine basis, I need to handle complaints. I need to keep evolving the technology and engage in regulatory work. So we are an image first system that puts us into the, technically we're a PACS or a picture archiving system. And so regulatory work is constant and ongoing with ISO and with FDA. We also need to ensure safety. So we need to manage our post-market research. We need to understand what kind of harms can be done through the improper use of interconnected technology. So we need cybersecurity, and we also need an escalation to real actual humans. So the biggest risk is when something is just completely autonomously automated and is acting on its own and taking its own decisions. There has to be a mechanism to escalate issues to an actual human. Now, we also want to really cause a population impact. We know that in medicine, technology is very slowly adopted. And there is a huge variety of vendors, many of which will not be around in 5 years. So when we talk about an enterprise level solution and choosing the vendors who we're going to integrate with, all of those can be, particular considerations, I should say, when we're trying to really create population impact. And then just briefly about the wrong priorities. So sometimes using technology can be time consuming. That's why over and over again, I see people have an EMR that's capable of doing a STIM sheet, but they're still doing it on an Excel document or creating a calendar in an Excel document and emailing it to a patient. A lot of times our EMRs or our software platforms are focused on what brings in revenue streams, so billing and documenting. And really a lot of our technology, I would say, doesn't spark joy. So in a lot of times what I'm thinking about is how do I spark joy with my technology? How do I make it fun to engage? How do I draw people in to actually enjoying using the technology? Okay, so just to talk a little bit about some of the types of integration that we're talking about here. When I think about time-lapse incubators, the very first technologies that enabled it were the microfluidics and the liquid handling, as well as the optics and the automatic refocusing on the embryos, because they're alive, they're moving, there's Brownian motion in the liquid handling of the instrument and the chambers of a time-lapse incubator chip. So then we move to the realm of analytics, which is kind of where we're living right now, is getting these AI technologies up and going, understanding the patterns of embryo development, making predictions, and basically at the same time we're generating results, we're also generating an interpretation of those results. And the nice thing about that is that it's non-invasive. But in the future, where we want to go is, how do you take these first two enabling steps and then put that into a complex care pathway through integration with a limb system? How do we get the information out to broader teams, maybe not just your embryology team, but actually get it to the clinicians and other people who are making care decisions, and then as well notifying the patients of their own results. And in order to do all of those things, we really need cloud-based technologies. So as far as engaging patients goes, I think about an enhanced communication. And I think for the patients, there's really three big buckets: appointment scheduling, managing the STEM calendar, and then being able to ask technical questions. I've heard of some physicians who give their cell phone number to their patients, and their patients can call them in the middle of the night to ask how to mix a medication, or what to do in case they administered a shot incorrectly. But there's also this huge component of psychological support for the patients. And some of the newer technology that's coming out is around AR and VR, so virtual reality and assisted reality, and telehealth, as well as patient monitoring. So moving some of these really intensive activities that patients have to do in the lab, that's come to the lab for, that's so disruptive of their lives, to possibly moving some of that monitoring at home to make their lives easier and to be less disruptive in an IVF cycle. And we can also think about how to use AI-powered chatbots to psychologically support our patients through these emotionally tumultuous times that they're going through. And, I also think about moving this to more of an enterprise level solution. So one of the things that happens a lot to us as embryologists is we get unexpected results. So all of a sudden we do a retrieval that yields, 50 eggs, or we have a run of patients where the blast rate is really high and it was very unexpected. So what if our ultrasound machines or these new patient monitoring ultrasound devices can actually alert us in advance to possible procedural changes, or that there could be some unexpected volume where we were not previously expecting it. And I have to say that this always happens on a holiday or a weekend, right? So it can also help us with staff scheduling and being able to anticipate higher than normal volume. And one of the modules of Art Compass is all around training and proficiency. And so right now we put all of our data into the system, and where could the future of those data take us? Can we actually analyze our team's strengths and weaknesses with the procedures that they know how to do and are proficient to do, and be able to optimize teams through a higher order analysis of the data that we're putting into a platform like ART Compass? And can we actually schedule per diems to come in and help us with unexpected absences, unexpected volume, and make that whole process of finding additional support for our labs much more meaningful. So there are several other modules in ART Compass. So the competency assessment and the proficiency testing is one of them that is the oldest module. It's the first one we made. It's the most highly used module of the whole platform. And so I think that the target for that one for the future will also include not just can we put our, answers into the system, but can the AIs actually start training us to make better decisions that are enhance the way we practice embryology, and also to build optimal teams, which we talked about a little bit earlier. But in our reagents module, I can also think about enhancing that to include one-touch ordering or just-in-time ordering, so you're not keeping a lot of inventory on hand, and to create higher visibility of what is actually happening in our labs in terms of plastic use, reagents use, busy times, unexpected use of reagents, and even for the occasional lot that might be different from another lot and be causing a lower blast rate. So can we have automated analysis of these? And to really monitor what's happening in our culture systems with these, lot to lot variations. And then in the policies and procedures module, I can also think of a very near future. And if anybody's interested in this, please get into contact with me after the webinar. But I would like to start, scanning our policies and procedures with natural language processing, automatically comparing it to the CAP guidance, and providing lab directors with automated recommendations for improving their policies before their next CAP inspections. And I can also, we track adverse events within our Compass as well. And what we don't do a good job of is connecting those adverse events when they happen to retraining on the policies and procedures. And so I can see more of an automation of that happening in the future as well. I think as a lab director, that's what I would love to see. Okay, so there have been several epic parody accounts, but sometimes I think parody and comedy tends to shine a light on something that has a real element of truth to it. So what we're not getting out of our current systems is the type of analysis that you see here. So for example, the number of progress notes written or the number of notes that went unsigned, how many sheets of paper were printed, things like failed login attempts, and what are the most common questions that you're asking in your clinical practice, or how many minutes did you spend doing something? And so all of these comments I found to be very, enlightening and an instruction for us really, us digital technology creators, of where to go in the future to provide this level of operational intelligence to the people who are using our systems. So this is my very last slide. I told you it was going to be a short talk today. But what I want to see out of our digital technologies is that it really supports our research opportunities. There's two types of research that we engage in. The type we do every day is validation of any new procedure, reagent, or instrument in our lab. We want to validate those usually with retrospective data, sometimes with discarded embryos or discarded tissues that are used for these types of studies, but also to do case studies in prospective cohorts. So I think as it stands currently, with many digital technologies, it's very difficult to pull prospective cohort data. If I want to query, eClinical, and I don't mean to pick on eClinical, but if I want to query eClinical to see how many people who have come in who have had a hysteroscopy or who are diagnosed with endometriosis, it is very, very difficult to do that type of study. But we can also see how our digital technologies can actually support discovery. So we have this real world data which is very highly sought after. We also can have integration with wearables and apps. We have very heterogeneous populations in our clinics, and we can manage clinical trials enrollment with the various clinical trials that are happening everywhere if we had better connectivity and more advanced digital platforms. And we can also talk about the new world of DIY diagnostics. And in our field, this really exploded at the beginning of COVID, where the hormone testing platforms, semen analysis, there are a lot of at-home DIY diagnostic opportunities in our field now. And we need to not ignore those. We need to pull that data in and be able to use it to generate new insights. So I think that was my very last slide. And I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I see there are a couple questions here. I'm wondering if we should leave them to the end.
Thank you so much. Thank you. No, yes, for sure. We're gonna tackle those questions at the end of the presentation. Our next speaker is gonna be Dr. Victoria Jung. She's an REI fellow at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. She has received her MD at Wake Forest School of Medicine and completed her OBGYN residency at Emory University. She has great interest in using AI to improve clinical outcome in IVF. Victoria, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me today. Thank you to the entire Progenesis Academy for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to be talking today about kind of how are we integrating artificial intelligence into quality assurance and different kind of key performance indicators or measures that we can use to really consider the meaningful use of AI within this space. Next slide. So one of the first ways our group got kind of interested in developing more artificial intelligence technology is really looking at really simple answers to simple questions using image data. And so you guys are probably familiar with the image that we have as the bottom, which is kind of a pictorial representation of how our convolutional neural networks work. And so one of the first questions that we wanted to really try to tackle when developing these kinds of image-based artificial intelligence networks was really looking at embryo development prediction. And so embryo development prediction in this case is essentially looking at an image of a day 3 cleavage stage embryo and trying to see if you can predict whether or not the morphology at that time taken at the time of our day 3 embryo check would be able to subsequently be predictive of the likelihood of blastocyst conversion on day 5 or day 6. And as we start pushing our embryos out further and further to really start thinking about cultures when we're thinking about decision-making tools, thinking about embryo development prediction was kind of the first images that we wanted to really see if it would be able to be predictive. So essentially what we did was we took a number of day 3 embryos and we were able to kind of develop a CNN or image-based model to be able to look at likelihood of conversion. So if you want to go to the next slide. Next slide. So when we were looking at day 3 to 5 blastocyst prediction, we were able to develop a convolutional neural network that assessed day 3 embryos and we're able to predict day 5 blastocyst conversion with a sensitivity of 85.8%. Thinking about the positive and negative predictive value here is we were able to get nearly 90% accuracy within our models. And within the top 1 selection developing to the blastocyst stage among the cohort of embryos that was introduced to the model, we had a 90.4% prediction rate. And then within the top 2 selections, we were able to have a 97.1% prediction rate. And so looking at this model, you can see the power that artificial intelligence has in being able to develop really useful key performance indicators when you're looking at how you can assess this from a quality assurance and quality improvement kind of standpoint. If you want to go to the next slide. When you're looking at the embryo development prediction, when looking at the saliency maps that we had present, it was definitely assessing the different morphologic markers that we were hoping it to, because we always worry about what exactly our model is looking at and identifying as important markers. What was actually really interesting was that when we were looking at prediction accuracy about likelihood of the day 3 to day 5 embryo to develop into a blastocyst, it actually outperformed almost every other blastocyst prediction model that we had, which was really looking at different times of morphology as well as time-lapse imaging information that we were able to kind of pull all together. And so looking at these models, you can see the power that artificial intelligence has in being able to develop image-based models and how they can contribute to being able to predict these kinds of embryo development markers. If you want to go to the next slide. So thinking that we were able to kind of develop this powerful model, we were really starting to think, how can we really integrate this into quality assurance within the IVF lab? And how can we seemingly integrate this into how this could potentially aid in our decision-making when it comes to really important developmental markers? And so if you want to go to the next slide. We started really thinking about quality control measures and monitoring that is essential within each embryology lab. And so I know many people on this call are very familiar with the rigorous QC that is required for properly running a lab on a daily basis. If you're thinking about incubators, surface temperatures, refrigerators, freezers, your material, contact material testing, such as culture media and dishware, there's so many different factors that really contribute to the successful culture and the cultivation of a very successful embryology lab. And so thinking about how we can take each of these touch points and really create kind of integrate it in with our artificial intelligence models so that we can not only have better quality within our lab, but then also better in our monitoring techniques when it comes to having fast decisions and changes on a daily basis. Specifically, we wanted to look at key performance indicators. If you want to go to the next slide. Key performance indicators that could be valuable markers of the culture system as well as of the quality of the materials that we're using what's inside the lab. So key performance indicators, KPIs, as you may all be very familiar with, is the topic of this kind of conversation that we're having today, is really thinking about a set of quantifiable measures used to gauge a laboratory's overall performance. And so the most common KPI that we kind of think of in the embryology lab or within any kind of IVF clinic is really clinical pregnancy rate. And so pregnancy outcomes, whether it be clinical pregnancy versus live birth outcomes, versus SAB rates, biochemical rates, really looking at any of these kinds of pregnancy outcomes, likelihood of implantation, all those different pieces kind of play together into what are the most common KPIs that labs throughout the United States use. While this is definitely our end-all be-all goal of the IVF process and definitely a good marker in that capacity of the overall big picture of our embryology lab, we also need to be thoughtful about how we're utilizing this, especially when we're making day-to-day decisions, when we're thinking about QC within the lab. And so one of the major issues thinking about pregnancy outcomes as a major KPI with how you're making decisions is that there can be significant delays in the results that you can have, in the sense that it takes several weeks to months to really just know what the outcome of a pregnancy was, or even get a patient to graduation from the initial embryo transfer. Also, too, there's been a significant delay in pregnancy outcome results, compounded by the fact that there have been significant increases in PGTA and freeze-all cycles. And so that can be really challenging to really try to decipher exactly if there was an issue with your culture system or any of your incubators 6 months, 8 months down the line when we were having finally having successful transfers and whatnot from that cohort. This delay in outcome results makes it very difficult to identify and correct variables affecting embryo culture in a very timely manner. And so we wanted to try to see how artificial intelligence can kind of play into deciphering which KPIs could actually be useful for short-term feedback within your culture system. You want to go to the next slide? So sorry, the slide got a little kind of blocked at the very bottom, but you kind of can get the gist of what the design of our study was. So we wanted to specifically assess the utilization of artificial intelligence, particularly that blastocyst conversion CNN model that I just reviewed with y'all, and trying to see if that could really keep up with any of the other embryo markers that we've been previously using as signs of development. And so we looked at embryos at 68 hours and then subsequently at 113 hours, which is essentially our day 3 and our day 5 embryo check. And then so subsequently at those kind of time and transfer those kinds of time points, we would be making decisions for either whether we'd be transferring versus culturing, extended culture versus vitrification and whatnot. And so looking at these important time points, we were able to get 1,190 annotated embryo images to train a CNN to predict the development of cleavage stage to blastocyst stage on day 5 of culture. And so looking at those 68-hour images and then seeing if it was at all predictive of whether or not it could become a blastocyst. A total of these embryos, 876 were cultured in 6 different lots of media throughout a course of time. And then looking at the different lots of media, they were able to be operated under identical conditions, 37 degrees Celsius, 5% oxygen, 6.5% CO2 with an oil overlay. And then we subsequently used a deep neural network to be able to see if we could predict in vitro embryo development just from the 68-hour images alone. If you want to go to the next slide. We had looked at a number of different cleavage stage KPIs that have been previously predicted based upon morphology alone, and then compare that specifically with our AI generated algorithm of day 3 to high quality blastocyst conversion percentage. When we were looking at the thresholds, we were able to set a pregnancy threshold of 50% for our program. And any time that it was below 50% pregnancy mark for these cohorts of embryos, we would count that as a low threshold value, or potentially a sign that there could be an issue with our culture system. The percentages were calculated from the number of 2PNs that were in culture on the first day at this fertilization check, and we were able to grow the embryos out to day 5 or day 6 to try to see the ultimate outcome of likelihood of blastocyst conversion. If you want to go to the next slide. I don't know, my animations are not quite lined up, but when we're looking at these images, we wanted to be able to see, with that pregnancy threshold set at 50%, would there ever be a system that would be able to see if there were differences in the performance of the media lots that were used to be able to culture these embryos? It's a little bit, sorry about this image here, but you can see that as the pregnancy rate for media lot B is actually just below that 50% mark, it's right around 45%. And so we wanted to see if any of those other KPIs would be able to mirror the drop in pregnancy rate that we witnessed with that changes in those lots of media. And so initially we started looking at, you can go to the next slide. So initially you see this blue line here. You can see that the good quality 4-cell embryos, when you're looking at that specific marker, did not necessarily mirror or even give us an indication that pregnancy rate, which would have been 4 to 6 weeks out from the time of transfer, that the pregnancy would have necessarily dropped based upon that marker altogether. You can go to the next slide. Looking at good quality looking at good quality 8-cell embryos, we still had a very different pattern that we saw in comparison to what our actual conversion rate was versus pregnancy rate. Go ahead to the next slide. So pretty fast. We were looking at good quality 6 to 10-cell embryos, which also didn't necessarily show us what you expected. And then we even above that went up to greater than or equal to 7-cell embryos. So you can go to the next slide. So you can see, as we've gone through several of these different KPI measures that are traditionally used to be able to see the quality of the culture system, that there were challenges in each of these systems being able to adequately mimic the subsequent drop in the pregnancy rate that we would have subsequently seen. And so when we looked at our last kind of marker, you can go to the next slide. So when assessing our AI predicted likelihood of high quality blastocyst conversion, when we were looking at our model, you can see that it slowly but surely was able to kind of mirror that changes in the pregnancy rate that we saw within our actual culture findings. You can see that there was this dip down below the threshold of conversion, which around 35% in this case. There was a drop below that marker, and then subsequently mirrored and gave us relative findings with a very close R-squared curve to the actual findings that we had with our pregnancy rates with these different lots of medias. And so through this study, you can go to the next slide. it was the only cleavage stage KPI that could be subsequently used, and really kind of shows the promise that artificial intelligence has when they have AI generated developmental prediction to be able to show the fluctuations in culture systems that can subsequently affect our clinical outcomes. The R squared for that was actually 0.90. So you can see it was very, very closely mimicking that line. Go to the next slide. Now, when you're thinking about quality within a lab, not only do you have to really thinking about the culture environment, but you also want to be really thoughtful about making sure that there's a high standardization among the embryologists that are doing the grading within. So one of the major challenges and one of the major challenges of blastocyst grading and manual embryo morphology grading is the fact that it can be quite subjective among different embryologists that are grading these embryos. You can go to the next slide. So I'm sorry, these slides kind of got misformatted, but you can kind of see that within these different stages that you have within, we were able to develop a small little grading app that we utilize within our internal lab to be able to really try to see if we could decipher this level of subjectivity among the different embryologists that we're grading. And so thinking about this kind of app, it kind of separated each image down to different stages, the inner cell mass, the trophectoderm, and these were a standard set of tested test embryos that each embryologist was exposed to, then subsequently had a period of washout, and then we retested again down the line. And so you can go to the next slide. Through really looking at this group of embryologists that we had that were testing, there was actually quite a high level of inconsistency when we're looking at manual embryo grading, which is one of the biggest challenges of the Gardner grading system that we have. If you can see that there is a high level of variability among the different embryos that they were grading, and you can see that even that level of subjectivity, while you may ask, you know, if it's a 5AA versus a 5AB, how much of a difference can that make? If you want to press the little animation, see if it pops up. We always want to think about all the different decision points that can be made from that embryo grade. And so when you're thinking about high grades with very subtle differences that may not necessarily impact clinical outcomes, when you're thinking about those borderline calls between whether or not you would actually biopsy or vitrify or go for extended cultures, these inconsistencies could actually lead to a number of different decision points within the clinic that can be really, that could really affect your outcomes down the line. If you want to go to the next slide. So looking to tackle that issue, we were able to apply the utilization of convolutional neural networks in specifically doing blastocyst stage classification. And so thinking about blastocyst stage classification, we wanted to be able to see if we could actually train a model to look at images and actually have more consistency in the way that they actually identify the blastocysts there. Then we were able, and then you want to keep going, next slide. We were able to then subsequently test our embryologist again through that period of washout to really decide whether or not at these time points would they actually have made, would they have had consistent decisions when it comes to major decisions like biopsy or freezing. If you want to go to the next slide. What was really remarkable when you're thinking about really important decision points like embryo biopsy or embryo freezing, if you want to press the animation. If you're looking at embryo biopsy and embryo freezing, you can see that red dot in the very top right corner was actually right around 80%, where you can see that the AI was actually incredibly consistent in deciding whether or not embryo biopsy versus embryo freezing, those decision points was extremely consistent when they're assessing these images, showing that there is an objective benefit in the utilization of AI compared to the embryologists that we had tested. If you're looking at the little blue dots here, you can see there was a high level of a variation of consistency about whether or not the same embryo graded by the same embryologist after a period of washout would have had that same decision. And so you can see how inconsistencies among that group can be really challenging when you're thinking about these really important decision points. You want to go to the next slide? Oh, unfortunately, these are very misaligned. But if you look at, if you want to press a little animation, we then subsequently were able to expose them to 113-hour embryo selections from a larger cohort of 12 like this, where essentially they would choose which ones to discard and which ones to vitrify. And you can see that there was a very low consistency in embryo selection when you had a cohort of 12. Next slide. Even down to a cohort of 4, there was still low consistency among embryo selection. And then the very last slide. And even when it was 1-to-1, where there was only 2 embryos present, you can see that there was a high level of inconsistency among those. Next slide. The CNN in this case outperformed. Okay, go to the next slide. I think this is not the right. Okay. So then looking at this, we also wanted to take this to the next level and really kind of assess kind of implantation outcome and potential. And so we were able to kind of look at how can we use these and really extrapolate that to the next level of implantation potential. So go ahead. So using those same test principles, we were able to look at whether or not our CNN directly compared to our embryologists and differentiating implantation potential had any kind of comparison. And they were able to show that the CNN had higher accuracy when you're looking at choosing embryos based upon the implantation potential, in this case, based upon highest grade. Go to the next slide. While this may seem like this is kind of a conversation of, oh, we're trying to really objectify this imaging, maybe we don't necessarily need to have eyes directly looking at the blastocyst. I think one of the major critiques of these kinds of systems is that we will never have any kind of lab where we don't have embryologists there to be able to aid in those decision makings and ultimately override the artificial intelligence. So finally, I want to just present some data in these last couple of minutes, kind of really looking at the selection with and without the utilization of AI in assistance with the embryologist that's present there. So if you're looking at these, we were able to look at the correct selection without AI. So if you're looking at the correct selection of embryo that's likely to become a clinical pregnancy based upon manual morphology, you can see that there was not only a high variation among the embryologists and the embryos that were selected, but you can see that there was a high range for the accuracy that was present there, ranging from as low as 55% up to as high as almost 80%. When we looked at AI selection alone, AI was able to correctly select the embryo that was most likely to lead to a clinical pregnancy at 78.5%. So you can see it outcompeted every embryologist and every embryo in that selection. Go ahead. But one thing that we thought was really interesting was that in every kind of scenario, when you're looking at different embryos to select, AI in assistance with the embryologist was able to improve that embryologist selection, really working hand in hand and making those clinical decisions at those important time points. This is some data looking at how we are actually really excited to have this paper kind of recently accepted for publication. So just check out our upcoming publication in JARG that looks at a number of different other markers that you can really be testing when you're looking at embryo transfer rates, vitrification rates, as well as warming rates when it comes to performance, when it comes to implantation potential. If you want to do the next slide. You can see that depending on the graphs here, based upon the embryologists or the MD that was performing the transfer, or in this case, vitrification or biopsy, the impact on implantation potential could really be one of those really fast markers that you could kind of turn around as far as really identifying lapses within your staff that can assist in kind of monitoring techniques and standardization of the hands that are kind of handling all of the different embryos and eggs. So kind of in conclusion, really thinking about the utilization of artificial intelligence within these systems, you know, AI can have a high impact of applications, particularly in quality assurance. And we've shown a number of different KPIs that are outside of the standard kind of developmental markers that we look for, that redefining the KPIs to meaningful indicators within your lab is going to be essential in really standardizing the care that you provide and also the culture environment that you have within your laboratory. excuse me, this is our team. And then our last slide. Thank you so much for having me.
So the challenge I see is that, you know, AI is almost like a black box, right? You don't know what type of algorithms have run, or you don't know what type of characteristics of embryos have been chosen. Is it supervised? Is it unsupervised? And it's such a difficult language for embryologists. How can we bridge that gap so the embryologists at least can look at different AI solutions and say, okay, this is more suitable to me than another?
Yeah, I can try to take a stab at that question. I think that's a really big question. Here's Victoria here. That's a really big question that I think has been really challenging for a lot of AI groups to really address. It's definitely one of the biggest conversations that we're having at a lot of conferences is really how do we tackle that black box? How do we know exactly what this algorithm is assessing? And how do we know that the results that we're giving are not only consistent, but they're like consistent with what we know for the science of today? I know that for us, when we're thinking about designing any kind of model within our lab, there's a couple of things that we are really thoughtful of. I'm a big believer that not all data is good data, in the sense that sometimes there's a message that we need to be putting in as many pieces of data, as many pieces of information that we can even extract out of the EMR, where really thoughtfully choosing your predictors, ensure predictors that you know are actually going to be linked, like maternal age, for example, to the quality of the eggs, the quality of the embryos, and the results that you're getting. I think training your system based upon really thoughtful predictors is going to be key, because not every piece of, you know, they always say garbage in, garbage out. If you put in too much information into a model, it starts acting really chaotically and doesn't give you consistent results. The other thing that I think that is really valuable is that when you're thinking about selecting those predictors, that you're really looking at is looking at not only saliency maps, so really looking at what exactly is the algorithm, especially in image-based data. It's a little bit more challenging in kind of continuous or categorical variables, but thinking about image-based data, like what exactly is that AI system looking at? What is it detecting as important spaces? And I think one of the questions that was posed in kind of the Q&A session was kind of really thinking about potentially using annotated data. I think annotated data can help guide at least the AI to look at different portions that you have deemed as important, knowing that our subjective deeming may also be potentially biasing the system. I think are really two things that I always think about when I'm trying to figure out exactly how can I tackle that question of what is being seen by the system.
Yeah, Carol, is it more important for the embryologist to dictate what is important for the AI to look at, or the other way around?
Yeah, there are a lot of great points to both of those, right? A lot of pros and cons. So obviously, as trained, you know, clinicians who have trained for a long time, that type of 30, 40 years of experience is the type of knowledge that we want to accelerate the transfer of to our AI systems. But each pixel has, you know, 1,000 shades of gray in it. It's many more than what our human eyes can detect. So there will always be things that the computers can see that we can't see. So some of the really like kind of cool, neat work that AIVF has published in the past has been about taking the important pixels and sort of masking the pixels around them to reduce some of the noisiness of the data and help us focus on what is really important. And some of the future work that can happen in the AI space is we can actually use artificial intelligence algorithms to interrogate other artificial intelligence algorithms to interpret them and explain them for us, and to tell them what they were, you know, kind of reverse engineer them. What were they focusing on, so that we have explainability. Now, you don't have to use a super fancy model to interrogate your algorithms either. You can just do it simply with statistics. The only caveat there is that patient demographics such as age and AMH tend to swamp out any other variable. So sometimes those can be such strong predictors that when they're included in an AI model, you know, you lose some of the finer detail that if you sort of mask those strong patient demographics, you can kind of get different accuracies it out of your model. So I think there's, they're all interesting questions that as a field we're currently grappling with. But I did just do a very interesting sort of retrospective study where we took data sets that were artificial. So we took 5 really high quality embryo images, 5 very low quality embryo images, and then 10 that embryologists had fierce disagreements on. So we basically had a clinical decision, 50% freeze and 50% discard. And we asked the AI to take a look at those. And the AI was able to identify 2 embryo images out of every data set that when we went back to the embryologist to discuss that clinical decision with them, they would actually change what they were thinking with the input of the AI. So we have to understand that all of our data sets that we annotate ourselves are biased. And that's what we're using to train the AIs with. So the notion also of using raw unannotated data is another one that's been, bandied about in the field. Should we be taking the human element out of it entirely? Now, there is a problem with that aspect as well. All embryos that we replace back into the uterus have undergone human selection bias. We're not replacing back embryos that we don't think have a good chance at pregnancy. So it can be very difficult. Now, I think where we can start to ask some other interesting questions could be in certain countries where you do have to replace all the embryos. So we have good data about replacing low quality embryos. But finding those collaborators and drawing out those data sets to make our AI algorithms diverse and geographically meaningful and all those things are like exactly what the field is grappling with right now. Sorry, that was a lot.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. So I was going to ask a similar question on that aspect. So the first component is we see certain AI solutions that focus more on images, static images. Others are using time-lapse, live images. Are they similar in terms of predicting value of prediction or prediction value? The second component of the question is, if you have to bet on using a data set, whether it's images or videos, and you test them on, now we have what, 7 or 8 AI solution, would you get the same answer in your opinion? And this is open for both of you.
So Nikita Zaniovic just ran a big study that he's been promising us a full-length paper on now for a year. I kind of have to tease him a little bit about that. But he did present it at ESHRI last year. And, the performance can vary significantly, but it's very difficult to compare. It's an apples to oranges comparison to compare one AI to another when they're on different data sets. So it has to be on a similar data set. Now, all the AUCs are pretty good, but the ones that include morphokinetic video data are much better. And there is no question about that you will always be able to get, better predictive models out of, I think, more data. So when you're looking at a single static image, the better thing to do might be to combine that with some patient demographic data from the EMR, which is currently siloed.
Yeah.
Right. Or the genetics data coming from their pre-IVF workup or, diagnosis, or any of those things could be combined with a single image to increase the accuracy of those models. But we're not there yet.
And testing different AI solutions on a same set of data. What is your prediction in that?
So I think Charlie's lab, if you want to answer it, Victoria, did provide a very large data set in one of the papers that they published into the public domain. But there are a lot of questions about who would house the data set, who should house it. Should it become a government sponsored entity like the Human Genome Project, where you can go online and see the human genome? Should it be housed within SART? And what is the ground truth? And there are a lot of questions around that, but I do think that SART could be, they have the expertise and they could be a really nice place to house those kind of data that could be requested to be used by various companies, including commercial interests, to advance the whole field.
Yeah,
I think what Dr. Kurtro is kind of mentioning too, kind of Carol was mentioning, is one of the biggest challenges that we have of this field is that so much of the data is siloed, and that as we have access to imaging data, access to patient characteristics or demographics, all of that has been turned into kind of really proprietary, access only kind of information, even from a de-identified standpoint. I think right now we're working with a lot of algorithms that are using static images, predominantly because video sharing and video image processing can be so incredibly challenging to be able to share among institutions and really create validated models. When you're looking at the amount of data that you're looking to be able to create thoughtful kind of image data sets, you're thinking about thousands of images, and that would be hours and gigabytes of video data if you're really looking at it. I think thinking about video and time lapse, I think looking at that entire morphologic kind of pathway is definitely going to have the key to being able to understand the morphology that we're kind of equating to clinical outcomes. But I think it's going to be incredibly challenging because of inherently, we are choosing images right now based upon time points that we have deemed as important, partially because of this is when the lab comes in on Wednesday mornings, when they're doing their day 3 checks, like this is the time of the day that we have, that we're doing fertilization checks, and all of those time points are selected kind of artificially. And so thinking about that video imaging, I think we'll be able to have that once we have better data sharing agreements that we have. Dr. Borman, Dr. Shafi, who I work with at Harvard, we have published a accessible public domain image database that you can train images from and really use as test and validation sets. I think one of the major issues that we have too is that there's just no uniformity in imaging platform that we have. And so a lot of the structures that we have in a lot of the algorithms that are trained on EmbryoScope data, which is fantastic because of quality of image, but knowing that not every lab can have access to that or chooses to want to have access to that can be really challenging when you're really trying to equate one algorithm to another. I think overcoming some of these domain shifts and these biases are going to be really key to having any kind of commercial entity being able to be a successful algorithm, especially in the context of regulation and consistency and standardization, that I think is going to be holding a lot of our companies back until we can really solve that problem.
no, that's a very good point. And we have been talking only about embryos and embryo images, but there are lots of other components in the IVF cycle that matters in the outcome. So you being a reproductive endocrinologist, what other phases of IVF treatment would you be most interested in measuring as far as AI?
Yeah. That's a really great question. I think for me, and there are some companies that are kind of starting to really delve straight into it, is really looking at egg quality. I think egg quality and egg grading, I think, is something that is way not nearly as developed as like cleavage or blastocyst grading, in the sense that, we have to believe that if to be able to become a day 3 embryo, day 5 blastocyst, you really have to have a high quality egg. So really delving into egg quality, I think, is going to be a huge game changer, that I know that there are some companies that are currently kind of tackling that question, like Violet and Magenta, really looking at how do we take the egg into account? I think for me, what I've really developed an interest in the last kind of 6 months is really looking at sperm morphology, in the sense that there really is no good genetic test for a sperm. Like once you use the sperm, it's kind of gone. Like we don't really have much besides the visual morphology that we have at the time of like semen analysis, or potentially at the time of ICSI selection. And, for me, going into REI, it feels like that very godlike moment where you're choosing that sperm to fertilize the egg, and it seems very like 1 in a million. And so I think really standardizing that, really understand how morphology links to the genetics behind the sperm and its contribution in fertilization, I think are going to be 2 key aspects of IVF that we haven't really even jumped straight into. I think a lot of it is focusing on the day 3 cleavage stage embryo and the blastocyst, but there's so many things that lead up to that point that need to be addressed.
And the stimulation, the level of FSH and LH and E2, P4, and all these
Even the
things.
uterine lining.
And
Even
you-
the uterine lining.
even because you have to have a receptive uterine lining.
so do you see AI playing a role there as well?
Oh, definitely. So one of the talks at the AI fertility conference was from Fairing, and they talked about some of their preliminary data integrating ultrasound images into an AI platform. And they found some very interesting signatures that they talked about preliminarily. I'm not going to summarize their data, but just suffice it to say that they, I'm sure, are going to be coming out with something that is extremely interesting and powerful in the near future. So it, I think, so when you look at like the IVF success rates, right, they're approaching 70% in some of the best clinics. But there's still that 30% gap where we need to address the environment that the embryo is going into. So, and those are some of the most interesting questions, is repeated implantation failures and pregnancy loss.
Awesome.
There was actually a follow-up question from one of our audience members, Dimitri, for Dr. Jiang. The question was, what are the viable approaches to improve egg quality?
Egg quality is, as we know currently, is very much mostly linked to kind of AMH and age. And so improving egg quality, I think, can be a really challenging question. I think that when you're thinking about counseling, especially with the advent of increased oocyte cryopreservation cycles, I think really thinking about utilizing this as a tool to really counsel people earlier, to be able to have tools that can say, from your group of 8 eggs that you froze at 32, we would expect probably 1 live birth out of that based upon these metrics that we have. And you will find that that's a lot of what kind of the violet and the magenta groups are doing up in Canada, is really trying to see, can you look at egg quality and really predict out likelihood of live birth when you're thinking about family planning down the line. As far as for actual improvements of egg quality, I think that can be really challenging, but I think especially in the context of Dobbs versus Jackson in the United States, and the kind of fear of antagonizing IVF, these tools can also be really useful when you're thinking about limited insemination and choosing eggs to fertilize when you have a cohort of like 10 or 12 or 15, particularly in the context of social or religious reasons.
Yeah, and so when you talk about equality, are you including the meiotic aneuploidy in eggs, and would IVF be a potential solution to identify those kind of genetic deficiencies, abnormalities?
Well, I think I'm thinking more of like looking at egg images, like when you have those oocytes that are retrieved, not only just like looking at the maturity of that egg from like M1 to M2, but also thinking about, are there any like inclusions inside? Are there vacuoles? Like how many of these cells, they extrude cells, like all these little pieces that kind of contribute to that likelihood of fertilization that we may not necessarily know the impact of quite yet. Because we always think about fertilizing every egg, but coming from really conservative states or really conservative communities that maybe don't like the idea of having embryos that are frozen in time, really thinking about limited insemination in the context of maximizing pregnancy outcomes can be a really interesting niche in applying this kind of technology.
Yeah, so the reason why I mentioned the meiotic aneuploidy is that, if you look at the aneuploidy rate in advanced maternal age, it could be as high as 80%, right? Or even 90%. It could be 50, 60, depending on age, right? So if you can save time and money fertilizing an egg that has very little chance of leading to a euploid embryo, maybe AI could help in that, right? You can just freeze it, not fertilize it, just freeze it, right? You save time, you save it. Is that something that could happen with AI, you guys think?
I think so. I mean,
I think
that
it can happen right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the patient acceptance of that and the clinician acceptance of that would be very low. And I also think about AIs in terms of telling the ploidy of the embryos or the implantation, potential of the embryos. Should we be freezing or biopsying every embryo? Probably not. We should be saving that labor and that burnout and that all those things by using these tools to reduce those workloads to only the viable embryos. But I don't think that that's going to go over very well with
Awesome.
patients or clinicians.
Well, we are reaching 4:30 p.m. in Pacific time. That's 7:30 in Eastern time. I really enjoyed the conversation with the three of you. It was very fascinating to see how much we know now about AI that we did not know only a year or two ago. Thank you so much for each one of you for joining. Sheila, thank you so much. And I will see you guys next month in the next webinar. And stay tuned for the future notifications. Thank you so much.
Have a good
Bye,
night,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
You
Happy
have a good
holidays.
night.